On today's episode, we will continue talking about potential trade pieces that the Dallas Stars could acquire this offseason. And today I'm joined by host of the Locked On San Jose Sharks podcast, JD Young, to talk about Brent Burns and the possibility of him reuniting with his friend Joe Pavelski this season. All coming up on today's episode of Locked On Stars.
Your Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to the Locked On Stars podcast, the only daily podcast covering the Dallas Stars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. I'm your host, Dane Lewis, your local expert on all things Dallas Stars hockey, credentialed member of the Stars Media, coming to you on this Thursday, June 16th. And whether this is your first time here or you are a recurring listener of the show, thank you for stopping in and making Locked On Stars your first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe to our show, hit the follow button on your favorite podcasting platform, leave a 5-star rating review of the show. It helps us out tremendously, helps the show continue to grow and develop. And on today's episode, I'm joined by JD Young of Locked On San Jose Sharks to talk about the possibility of Brent Burns being traded to Dallas for this season. Let's jump to that interview right now. Well, welcome in, hockey fans. This is Dane Lewis of the Locked On Stars podcast, joined now by a very special guest, host of the Locked On San Jose Sharks podcast, JD Young, and we're here to talk about a potential trade that maybe or maybe could not happen this offseason, but certainly one worth discussing. And we are talking about defenseman Brent Burns, who currently plays for the San Jose Sharks. That has been his team for the past several seasons. And to kind of get things rolling, JD is going to kind of start out by selling us on why we would want a guy like Brent on our team. He is getting up there in age, but still has shown that he has a little bit left in the tank. So, JD, if you were trying your best to, the show Shark Tank comes to mind, no pun intended, I guess. But if you were trying to sell Brent Burns to a potential buyer, in this case it being the Dallas Stars, how would you go about it?
Okay, so I know that's the first thing that comes up is Brent Burns' age, right? And he just turned 37, so this is his age 37 season. And you think that's really old, but Brent Burns is the most durable player in the NHL, right? He's actually led the NHL in time on ice last year, set a personal high in the most amount of minutes that he played last year, and has not missed a game since 2013, the 2013-2014 season. So you're getting a guy who's super dependable, and he's going to be there night in, night out. The guy is an absolute freak when it comes to taking care of his body. There's nobody in the NHL who does it better than him. And spoiler, the Sharks were really bad last year, and he still was producing numbers. So he had 54 points in 82 games, and that's not too bad. But the Sharks were the 28th team in scoring last year. So it's not like the Sharks were just racking up a ton of points and he was, actually like just benefiting from that. He was a large part of the Sharks offense. And yes, we know Brent Burns has always been, he's not the most defensive oriented guy, but like he can still play pretty reasonable defense. And I think for him, being in a situation with the Sharks where he's had to be the guy that minutes muncher for the Sharks, and he's done an outstanding job with that. And I think if you played a kind of a lesser role, which he would easily do in Dallas, especially behind, what's his name?
Miro Heiskanen.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Miro Heiskanen is going to be your top line defenseman. Brent Burns as a second pair defenseman, not too shabby. And I know the contract's going to be a thing. He's still on the books for 3 years, $8 million, but the Sharks have already, started exploring trades, and they'd be more than happy to eat some cap space to kind of free up Brent Burns from their cap space.
Yeah, and I think this is almost one of those situations where I think me personally, just looking at Burns' numbers, even from this past season, but really just for the past several seasons, like he's not slowing down with age. There's something in the water in San Jose that makes these players like him or Pavelski or Thornton, who can get up into their late 30s and still have really nice seasons. I mean, Pavelski
They
just
forgot
finished.
to share it with. They forgot to share it with Vlasic, but
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. They only have so much for a certain number of players, but this is almost a situation, I think, for Dallas where there could be excitement with a guy like Burns because of these, the numbers he still puts up and the playmaking that is potentially there on the blue line. But then I think for at least Stars fans who, paid attention really closely this last season, there's the fear of, could we get burned by age? Because that kind of happened with Ryan Suter this past year. I think he actually did pretty well on offense, and he was up there in time on ice. He played, I think, all 82 games, but there were just several moments where, and including in the playoffs against Calgary, where Dallas just got burned on defense because you have Heiskanen on one side, and then Suter would typically be the other guy in that pairing, but he would just get torched on defense by a guy like Johnny Gaudreau or Matthew Tkachuk. I mean, they're just going to be way faster than Ryan Suter, who's only a year or two younger than Brent Burns, I believe. So, and you mentioned not necessarily that he's a liability on defense, but definitely not, the speedy defenseman that he maybe once was. Yeah, at this point in his career, definitely not the center point of his game. So I think that's something that maybe Stars fans would be hesitant on, as well as the contract as well. I don't think that's as much as Suter's making. Ryan Suter making 3.6 a season, but he's on until like 2025, I think. So, it's just one of those things where, you might have to kind of weigh the pros and cons and then make a move. But, I think that he could pair really nicely, maybe even alongside Heiskanen if they decided they didn't want to have Suter anymore, or maybe with Esa Lindell, or even a guy like Yanni Hakanpää, who's I keep thinking he's a younger guy because he's new to the Stars, but he's actually a little bit older than I thought. But what would you say is like the benefit of Burns in the locker room? I mean, obviously we know what kind of player he is. Do you think that he could come in similar to a guy like Pavelski, who did such a really good job of just kind of oozing in, for lack of a better term, without much hesitation to be a leader? Do you think Burns could have that same effect if he goes to a different city? Has that kind of been his style as a teammate over the past few years in San Jose?
Yeah, he's he's been an alternate captain for the Sharks for a long time, and he's definitely one of those guys in the locker room where other players go up to him. I'm going to do a little bit of a humble brag here, but I just talked to Sharks forward Jasper Weatherby, and he was saying like after like the third game or something like that, Brent Burns comes up and goes like, "Hey, how you doing? And how you feeling?" And Jasper was like, "I'm feeling good." And Burns is like, "This is the last time you're going to be able to say that, type of thing," because it's just the grind of the season. But like, he's done a good job. I know he's worked with Ryan Merkley, who's a young defenseman, on trying to like kind of, change his body and kind of get him ready for the grind of the NHL. And, I think Ryan Merkley lived with him for a little bit. And, like Brent Burns he's like that. He's that guy in the locker room where he's going to definitely, be accepting and kind of come in and be a leader for a team. And I know that the Stars are a very veteran laden team, but I think he's definitely going to fit in, especially, with Joe Pavelski, where him and Burns made magic for years, where Burns just shots from the point, Pavelski just tipping those in, and you would see before and after practice where those guys, they would just work on that, and that's how Pavelski got so good at that, which is him and Burns spending that time together working on that. And you talked about Burns and the potential of the slowdown, but like a couple of weeks back, I did an episode where we looked at Brent Burns' offensive production compared to like some of the greats in the NHL, like great defensemen, like Nicholas Lindstrom and like guys like that. And he's producing in the same ballpark as these type of guys. Again, those guys are better like actual defensive defensemen, but like his offense isn't just going to fall off a cliff right now, especially with the way he takes care of his body. And again, I cannot stress this enough. The Sharks could not score goals. So if he's still producing points on a team that just can't score, you would assume that playing on a team where there's more offensive production and kind of more guys around, he'd be able to continue to put up points.
Yeah, and offense was something that was difficult for Dallas to come by this season as well. They're kind of the main idea that we've been focusing on this offseason, at least at Locked On Stars, is the search for that secondary scoring. And you would think most of it comes from guys that can play, maybe second line roles, because I think everything is kind of set in stone for Dallas on the top line and then in the crease and with Miro Heiskanen. And then everything else is kind of a TBD. It could get shuffled around. It just kind of depends on what the new head coach is looking for, which we still, at this moment, at the time of recording, don't have a new head coach, despite Rumors around this time last week of DeBoer getting that role, but it hasn't been announced yet. So still holding out for a different option. We know it's not going to be Bruce Cassidy, but yeah, there's so much that could go into that. And, Burns, I think, like you said, if he struggles on a team that can, be as offensive, or I guess lacking offense like San Jose, Dallas was the same way. But, if Dallas can add to their offensive core and then get a guy like Burns in there who has that established chemistry with Pavelski, but also just has that work ethic. You're very much right that this is a veteran-led team. And, I think it would be easy for him to come into a locker room like the one in Dallas and kind of know his role as not being the leader of the team, because I still think that's Jamie Benn as the captain, or Tyler Seguin, or even Pavelski, just even though he's been there a short time, I think has kind of taken on this role of basically, if Ben wasn't the captain, it would probably be Pavelski. So I think he could find a way to, come in pretty seamlessly and be a veteran leader that can mentor guys like Heiskanen, who is still really, really young and still has a lot of hockey ahead of them. And there's even a few other younger defensemen like Thomas Harley, who's I think still 19 or 20 years old, still has a lot of his career ahead of him as well. Could, provide some scoring, provide some points, but also, be a mentor for some of the next generation of Stars defensemen.
Yeah, and I think another thing too is if Pete DeBoer goes there, I mean, Pete DeBoer was the head coach with the Sharks when they went to the Cup, and guess who led that team? Joe Pavelski and Brent Burns, who Brent Burns was, I think, was it that year he won the Norris when the 16, or was it the year after? He won the Norris the 16-17 season when they went to the Cup. It finds you somebody the way Pete DeBoer loves using Brent Burns. And if Pete DeBoer goes to Dallas, like it's kind of feels like it's heading that way. It just makes too much sense for those guys to kind of reunite in Dallas. So,
yeah, that would be one part that I think could be somewhat exciting. But I know there's also some hesitancy with other Pete DeBoer things, but that's certainly a topic for another day.
You don't like power plays.
Well, you would think the Dallas Stars didn't like power plays based on their playoff performance, but it's a whole conversation for a different day. But we're going to continue this conversation about Brent Burns and what it could look like for him in Dallas, and talk about him potentially being a replacement for John Klingberg if he does leave this offseason. But first, we do want to take a moment and say thank you to one of the sponsors of today's episode of Locked On Stars and Locked On Sharks, and that is our friends over at Built Bar. Our friends at Built Bar are always coming out with amazing new flavors. Well, this time Built Bar has truly outdone themselves with their new Mud Pie flavor. And for the first time ever, Built Bar is introducing the new Mud Pie flavor in both Built Bar form and Built Bar Puff form. The new Mud Pie is rich with whipped cream and chocolate mousse, smothered in 100% real chocolate and topped with cookies and cream crumble. JD, does that sound appetizing to you? Are you about the mousse and smothered chocolate cookies and cream lifestyle? Is that something that sounds good?
Mine's in the fridge, ready to go. So yes.
I think mine are still in the mail, but when they get here, I'm very excited to give this one a whirl. And if you listening at home are also salivating in your mouth over this new flavor, you can check it out on Built Bar's website, just built.com, and you can even see the macros that it tastes delicious and is good for you with 16 grams of protein, only 150 calories, and 8 grams of sugar. You can go to built.com right now and use the promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off your order. Again, use the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off your order at built.com. Hey, Stars fans, Dane here. We have an important favor to ask you. We've put together a survey so we can learn more about listeners like you and make your favorite Locked On podcast better than ever. This is your opportunity to tell us what you like and don't like about Locked On Podcast. Go to lockedonpodcast.com/survey right now to get started. It won't take very long, and everyone that completes a survey can qualify for a chance to win one of 10 $100 Ticketmaster gift cards. To take our audience survey, go to lockedonpodcast.com/survey. Thank you guys so much for your help. Now let's get back to today's episode. And we're moving on this crossover episode between Locked On Stars and Locked On Sharks, talking about Brent Burns and what it might look like for him to be a member of the Stars next season. And it could be an important role for him to come fill in, as we just said before going to the ad break, that John Klingberg could be on his way out of Dallas. It kind of seems like a matter of when, not if, at this point. And I think that this could be an interesting trade. I know I've been thinking about this most of the day as we were prepared to record this episode, and was maybe thinking that Burns might not be a good replacement. But if you look at the numbers last season, I mean, Burns had a little bit more of everything. I mean, more goals, more assists, more points. And I mean, he's almost 10 years older than John Klingberg. John Klingberg's still 29, I believe. So quite the age difference, but yet still a lot more production from Burns this season. And I know many people are quick to point out, that maybe Rick Bowness was holding back John Klingberg, that his play's been on the decline ever since he came around. But again, just with the amount of money that Klingberg wants, I feel like he's on his way out. Brent Burns could be the guy, possibly, based on what you've seen, JD. I know you probably haven't seen a ton of John Klingberg, but do you think that he could be a guy that could come in and kind of replace someone who's been the guy on defense for the past several years? Do you think Burns is capable of that at this point in his career?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing with Klingberg, right, is, you said is his contract projections. So Evolving Hockey, who does a really good job with their contract projections, they pretty accurate within usually like a couple $100,000, except for like weird contracts. So they're projecting Klingberg at a 6-year, $6.883 million. So we'll just basically say $7 million. So it's like basically for $1 million, for $1 million more, you could have Brent Burns. That's if the Sharks don't eat any of the cap type of thing. And then you're also only getting him for half the time, right? But I mean, when it comes to like comparing their even you look at their fancy stats by Evolving Hockey, Klingberg is just kind of a mess in the defensive zone. He gives up way more expected goals and gives up actually more goals than Brent Burns. And while Burns doesn't have the same amount of offense, I think the trade-off there is you're getting Brent Burns, who's just a more reliable guy. He's not driving the offense maybe the same way Klingberg is, but he's also not a whole mess in the defensive zone. And I think, there's Sharks fans, there's plenty of times you can point to Brent Burns doing dumb stuff in the defensive zone. And, he's very famous for his starfish defense, sometimes, but like, you also have to look at the Sharks last year where, Erik Karlsson played, I think, like 50 games last year. And, Mario Ferraro missed a bunch of games, and Vlasic, who, the Sharks shelled out a big, contract for him, and he just hasn't been the same guy. So it's been literally Brent Burns having to carry the Sharks defense at this point. And, I think that for him playing in instead of having to play the 27 minutes a night that he's playing with the Sharks, if he's in that 22, 23 minute range, I think you're going to see a much more effective Brent Burns being able to kind of, I don't want to say concentrate, but, not having to kind of have those mental lapses because he's having to do everything for the Sharks defense. And again, if he's on your second pair behind, Miro Heiskanen, I think you're looking really, really solid with him and not having to, again, ask him to do the world like that he's doing for the Sharks right now.
Yeah, and I think that's huge too, is that you get him and he, if Burns does come to Dallas to play for the Stars, I think that's part of the sigh of relief, is that he's not expected to be the main guy. And obviously Miro Heiskanen had a tough season, battling, COVID at one point in the year, and then he had mono for a good stretch of the back half of the season, but still was able to put together a pretty nice season defensively. But I think he's really going to take that next step on the offense this season, especially whenever a new coach does get hired. Maybe, someone who can elevate his game offensively a little bit. And so I think that's a perfect role for Burns to come in and play, where he can, not have to be the main focus on defense, but can still give you, those minute eating nights, night in and night out, where he's super durable. I mean, played all 82 games last season.
He hasn't missed a game since 2013, 2014. It's insane.
Yeah,
especially for a guy, how much he plays. It's insane that he's just like, whatever, I'll play.
And to be like that size too, because 6'5", 230 is what NHL.com has him at. I mean, to be that size and to be probably in as many hits that like checks and checking situations that he's been in, like that's just unreal. So I think that's like also very valuable. A team in Dallas that is always looking to have healthy players. I think they did a pretty good job of what I say good job as if it's something they could control, but they had a lot of healthy guys last year that played really critical minutes for most of the season. And so I think he could come in and, fit that really well. And as far as Klingberg goes, I mean, obviously, as of right now, with him not being technically, signed for the team for the future, his, where he could end up going, kind of a mystery right now. Do you think he's a guy that you would want to see in San Jose, or do you envision him maybe going somewhere else and he might not be the best fit for the Sharks? What are your kind of thoughts on Klingberg as far as maybe being on San Jose this season?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely some of the, we'll get into trades. A lot of people have like, well, Burns for Klingberg's rights and then you re-sign him type of thing. But like the Sharks have so much money tied up in their defense right now, and they're really trying to get that kind of cleaned up a little bit. Erik Karlsson makes $11.5 million, and Vlasic, like I said, he's got, I think, 5 years and $7 million on his contract, and he's a potential buyout for the Sharks. And they tied up so much money there with their defense, and then their forwards. You got Logan Couture on a long term, 8x8 year deal. I think he's got 4 or 5 years left on that. Tomas Hertl just signed a new contract, and then Timo Meier is going to be expecting a new contract next year, and he might be potentially a $10 million player if he continues to play the way he did this year. But I think for them, they're going to try to. They don't really have other than Ryan Merkley, they don't really have like an A+ candidate in their prospect pool. So I think they're going to kind of go the cheap route for a little bit until they can kind of, maybe patchwork it together for a little bit. I just don't see them getting into another long-term defensive relationship right now with a player, just because, I think this offseason they're trying to work out of some of their cap issues. And then there, of course, was the whole Vander Kane situation where the rest of his contract's looming over, and the NHL for some reason decides that they can't get an arbitrator before free agency right now. So it's kind of a mess with their cap situation. So I mean, as much as Klingberg, he provides a lot of offense, I think the Sharks just don't have the cap space right now, and then they're trying to score more goals, and I think they're going to be trying to fortify their forwards right now, find some more depth scoring this summer.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's just going to take like the exact right situation for Klingberg to want to go to, one where he can really thrive and kind of take his game to that next level to be worth that. What was the amount of money that you said, like $7 million
so
that he's
they have him
projected?
6 point. So Evolving Hockey, they have him a 33% chance of signing a 6-year deal at 6.883, and then a 31% chance at signing a 7-year deal, and that'd be 6.819 million. So a little bit under 7 million for both. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think he would it'd have to be just the perfect spot. And of course, sometimes all a guy needs is just a change of scenery, and all of his problems go away. So don't really know where Klingberg will end up. I know that there's probably still a few people that think that he could still end up in Dallas, which would be a miracle. I just don't envision Jim Nill and company signing him for that much money, but we'll have to see what happens. And maybe a new coaching hire would make him more willing to stick around for less money. And then I feel like Brent Burns doesn't come in, but all of that is just hypothetical at this point and could certainly change, after what we see throughout free agency and the draft. I mean, that's what makes the NHL offseason so exciting. Yeah.
And then, getting into the Stars cap situation. I mean, who their big contracts this year? Like, do they have any kind of big free agents or anybody they have to re-sign?
Yeah. So the Stars offseason, I think the priority list goes Jake Ottinger, who's an RFA right now, as well as Jason Robertson, also RFA. But I imagine like both of those guys are, at least if I'm in the Stars front office, which I'm not, but I feel like with both of these players, I believe surprisingly, I'm not. For people listening who think I've been in the Stars front office, I'm sorry to disappoint you after almost a whole calendar year, if only. But it wouldn't take an NHL expert to know that, if you have a guy like Jason Robertson and Jake Ottinger on your team, you re-sign those guys just with how they played this past year. Ottinger, I would argue, was maybe the third best goalie throughout the playoffs, despite only getting 7 games. Just the way he shut down Calgary for the better part of that series until, game 7. If you go and look at that game-winning goal from Gaudreau, I mean, the margin of that goal was just
insane. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's just 9 times out of 10, Ottinger gets that save, and that was just the one that doesn't. So you re-sign him, you re-sign Jason Robertson, who's a 40-goal guy. And then everything else is just kind of a toss-up. I mean, you have Klingberg, who's a UFA. The rest of the defensemen outside of Andres Sekera, who's 36, probably not coming back and wasn't taking up a ton of cap room. Not a big deal there. And then on offense, it's kind of a lot of smaller guys. Alexander Radulov is already, committed to going back to Russia to play hockey. And then you have guys like Marian Studenic, who came over from the Devils this season, Vlad Nemestikov, who we got at the trade deadline. I would personally like to see him kept. I just don't know how much a guy like him is worth. And then Michael Raffel, another guy who we picked up last season as well from the Philadelphia Flyers in the offseason, had a nice year, but age 33. Don't really know how much money he'll be expecting. So Robertson and Ottinger definitely worth keeping.
So
wow.
Actually, I can tell you. So you're, according to Evolving Hockey, Jason Robertson is expected a 6 years, $7.865 million contract. I think he gets closer to, I think he gets like an 8 year deal.
Yeah. And I'd be fine with that.
Yeah. And that would put him about almost a shade under 9. Then Ottinger, he's a 3 year, 4.9. So a little under $5 million. It's kind of his expected contract. So
that feels about right too.
Yeah. I mean, you're going to have a little bit of cap space. I mean, you could definitely work up Brent Burns in there, but I think most likely to be one of those things where if the trade does happen again, so Brent Burns does have a 3-team trade list, and if he doesn't want to go somewhere, he's not going to go somewhere, and I think the Sharks have, I know they don't have a general manager at the moment, but Joe Will has been kind of running the show, and Brent Burns is so important to the Sharks where he's definitely, you could put him on the Mount Rushmore of Sharks players. But he said in his exit interview where he wants to try to win a cup, and sorry guys, the Sharks aren't winning a cup the next 3 years while Brent Burns is on the team. It's not going to happen. But in the Stars, it kind of makes sense where, he makes his summer home. He lives in Dallas. He has his huge ranch, or not in Dallas, but he lives in Texas. He has this huge ranch there. Him and Pavelski are very close friends. I know their kids hang out and all that fun stuff, but that's why the Stars kind of make the most sense. So, I think if we start kind of looking at a trade package where, maybe the Sharks, if they eat $2 million of the contract over the next 3 years, and then it's like, Dallas is paying $6 million for 3 years for Brent Burns, I think that's a pretty fair thing. And, the picks, I think the Sharks are kind of, they're trying to play we're reloading, and we think we can kind of win with our core, so maybe they want I think for them, the cap space is the most important thing. And then anything else you get on top of that is kind of, the cherry on top. So I think if you're looking at a 3rd round pick and then maybe a mid-level prospect, and then the Sharks eat $2 million of the contract, I think that's kind of the starting point for the trade right there.
Yeah. And you say 3rd round pick. I mean, I feel like with the Stars, they have all of their picks right now according to Cap Friendly, except the 7th round pick. They gave up a 7th round pick to Buffalo the other day in that whole Ben Bishop trade. That wasn't really a trade. It just helped the Sabres get closer to the $60 million minimum, and it helped the Stars clear $5 million on their books. So it was really just kind of a paperwork kind of deal. So they don't have a 7th round pick, but they have a pick rounds 1 through 6. So, there's really not just for the Sharks, but I feel like any team, the potential for a team to come in and maybe ask for a few picks this draft. I don't really know how hard the Stars are looking to go. They actually had a really good draft last summer. Wyatt Johnston and Logan Stankoven both playing really well in their respective CHL team leagues right now. I get all those teams in leagues mixed up, but I know both of them had really good seasons. And there's even talks that Wyatt Johnston's coach, Mark Savard, who played with Tyler Seguin in Boston and won a cup together in 2011, that he could potentially become the new head coach, which has already been talked about at length. But yeah, I can definitely see the Stars, especially for a guy like Burns, if they're only paying that $6 million for 3 years, maybe giving up a 3rd round pick or maybe even a 2nd round if that's something that San Jose is interested in. And
definitely,
then, of course,
we don't have one. So
so I feel like 1st round pick, maybe there's a line drawn there. Personally, myself, haven't done too much in-depth look at who's going to be available, and I think the Stars have the 18th overall pick. So it's kind of one of those things where, at that point in any draft, any sport, it's kind of like a toss-up of, in the NFL, you have all your big name guys, and then the Patriots will pick 18th. And they'll just take someone that you've never heard of. And that could very well be what the Stars do, just with how weird the NHL draft can be, especially, in the middle of the 1st round. So, yeah.
And this year's draft is especially after pick 3, because, I've been very heavy into the draft. And, after pick 3, it's a wide open mess of like who knows who could be available I mean, there's definitely good players in there, but it's very much put a bunch of names in a hat and pull a guy out type of thing, especially around that like 15, 16, 17, 18 range. So
yeah, and it's just like so difficult or different with hockey because it's, a lot of times unless you're getting like a Connor McDavid-esque player, you won't potentially see them at the NHL level for 2-3 seasons, and then maybe by the time they're ready for the NHL, they get traded or they, their contract ends and they go somewhere else. So I can definitely see Dallas if the price is right, like if the return is great enough, they give up that 18th overall pick in the first round. But yeah, definitely, I think, at least how I see it, a mid-level prospect and then a second or third round pick for Brent Burns. And I think that's something that both teams could definitely benefit from.
Yes, like I said, especially because the Sharks, they traded away their second round pick last year to get Aiden Hill from the Coyotes. So they don't have a second round pick. They're picking 11th in the draft this year, and they've been in the asset collection mode where they're trying to gather draft picks and stuff like that. But I think if the second pick, maybe the Sharks eat $3 million of it. It just, I think, kind of a little bit of a sweetener to try to give the Stars a little bit of cap freedom. But again, the big thing I think for the Sharks is trying to just free up some cap space where if they want to try to be a little bit more aggressive in free agency this year. And, I think they're really trying to add some secondary scoring. So that way it's not the Timo Meier, Tomas Hertl show, 82 games a year. And, maybe try to give Logan Couture a little bit of help or, try to not having to, ask guys like William Eklund and Thomas Bordeleau to kind of come in and just, burn down the league as rookies. And, I think they're going to both be really great players. But it's just a lot to ask these guys to just step in the league right away and just, be like, hey, I need you guys to be 50-point players your first season. It's a lot to ask for. So, I think that's, if they can use that $5 million to like, okay, let's go find a new 2C and then let Logan Couture play 3C. And it's like, okay, now we're kind of cooking with gas here. So.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds like, at least from what you're saying and how you've been covering the Sharks, that, it could be dark right now for the San Jose Sharks, but, better days are certainly coming with the talent and the prospect level. And even, guys like Hertl and Meier at the NHL level right now, who had pretty solid seasons despite the Sharks missing out on the playoffs.
Again.
I mean, I know the Sharks gave Dallas their fair share of troubles this year. So, and that's just how it was. It was all these like middle of the pack teams, like the Canucks just beat the brakes off the Stars in all 3 matchups this year. So it was the mid to bad level Pacific teams that just gave Dallas the hard times this season. So
yes,
for whatever that's worth, I know the Sharks are a team that, they gave us Joe Pavelski. So there's always a soft spot in my heart for a team like them. So I don't know. I say gave, I mean, but
that third year. It's really funny looking back on. I know we're not gonna do a lot of Joe Pavelski, but like it was Joe Pavelski or Vander Kane, and I'm sure if you could go back now and redo that decision, And the big thing with Joe Pavelski was, he wanted that third year, and the Sharks were like, I don't know about giving a third year to a guy who's gonna be I think he's 36 or 37 now. It's
37.
Yeah, it's like I just don't see you paying. He has like one of his best seasons ever this year. So it's
which like I don't blame them. I mean, how often do you see a guy like that have their best statistical year at that age? Yeah. So it's just one of those odd things with the NHL, and I don't know. We're getting at least 1 year of Joe Pavelski, so this could kind of be his last hurrah, and I'm sure he would love nothing more than to go out with Brent Burns at his side.
Yeah. So, all right. So second round pick, Sharks eat $3 million, and we'll get a mid-level prospect. Let's call it in.
Yeah. Well, I'll pretend that I work for the Stars front office, and I'll send that one over to Jim Mill. So
I'll text Doug Wilson Jr. So we'll get this going.
Yeah. Well, JD, thanks for crossing over today. And if it does end up going down, we'll have to get back on together and talk about the logistics of it.
All right. Sounds good, buddy.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed today's crossover episode with JD over at Locked On Sharks. Be sure to go give his show a follow on Twitter or on YouTube as well if you were interested in keeping up with the Sharks anymore this offseason. JD does some great work over there. Always glad to partner up with him for an episode. But thank you guys for tuning in today, for making Locked On Stars your first listen of the day. Be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube. We have surpassed 350 subs. We are on our way to 400. Be sure to also follow us on your favorite podcasting platform. Leave us a 5-star rating and maybe a review if you're on Apple Podcast. If you like what you hear, we will be back here tomorrow with more off-season content. Hope to see you there, Stars fans. Hope you have a fantastic Thursday. Remember to be loud, wear green, go Stars. You guys know the drill. We'll see you back here tomorrow.